Welcome back to YIIK, where, well, we've assembled the parade of Vellas, I guess. I don't know what you would call them.
Well, I mean, the collective noun for several musicians is a band, is it not?
Yeah, but that's too simple for this. There's nothing simple about this game. I don't want to give it a simple word.
Okay, then it is...
I personally am a fan of the Vaudevillains.
I like it. If we're talking about a particular collective noun, would we also say that it's a jam of musicians?
It would be a jam. Did you notice that piano playing animation?
Well, I'm trying to ignore everything relating to the piano now for my own benefit. Thanks very much to Thread for pointing out the specific fingering technique that was described in that notation, though description is kind of a strong word for it.
Yeah, no, thanks, Thread. I learned something that day. I think this is actually the same lady who sung Michael's. I mean, yeah. Sorry, yeah. You know the lady. She sung Michael's lead vocals.
Uh-huh. I mean, I want to say she's certainly a bit better than the, okay. She's a bit better than the guy who was singing when we were fighting that Soul Survivor way back when.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me of that. I kind of blocked that out.
Well, a lot happened in that episode, including David Cagean narration.
Listen to the record before we broadcast it. There was a certain aura of unease surrounding her.
Axe Studios went and uploaded all the soundtrack, well, most of the soundtrack, onto their SoundCloud channel. If, in fact, you ever get the urge to stab yourself in the ears with a couple pencils and listen to that song again, amazingly, it gets more poorly mixed as it goes.
I think it's obvious.
Huh.
Well,
I will say that, as we've pointed out, inconsistent and crazy as this soundtrack is, there are definitely a couple of high points.
Oh yeah, totally.
We talked about Hiroki Kikuta at some point. I think he's been credited as a contributor. I'd like to know on what exactly. Maybe we haven't heard it yet, but
I hope you enjoy what I made.
You know, I guess there's small things we still have to look forward to.
Yeah, no, this soundtrack definitely has some clout.
And
oh, spooky.
What? Okay, so once again, apropos of nothing, I don't know where this is.
There's no reason to be here.
So, okay, yeah.
Yeah, all we did was put on the record. We finally recovered Mystical Ultimate LP Legend.
I'm gonna just go ahead and say that a giant Alex in a robe, like laughing softly while standing directly behind Vella is possibly the creepiest image I've seen in this game yet.
And they all do it. You don't get anything by talking to the Council of Alexes. All the Ginger Sages, I guess that's what they're calling him now, they all just say ha ha ha. Also, apparently in Vella's alternate universe or whatever, they speak Japanese?
That is Japanese that they're singing. I don't know who the singer is. Since I was mentioning Hiroki Kikuta earlier, well, I know that's not him, but maybe this is his actual contribution to the soundtrack. So in your reality, well, I mean, in our reality, J-pop's pretty big, but it's...
Well, it's more big than it used to be, at least in the Western world, I guess.
True. Again, one of those odd world-building conceits could be, you know, what if all of those weird cyberpunk suppositions about Japan becoming the supreme economic and cultural powerhouse in the 90s ended up coming true?
Yeah, for all we know, Vella could have, I guess, come from a universe where the world of Blade Runner and the events therein were canon.
Meanwhile, as to what's actually being talked about here, from what I'm able to follow, it seems that these alternate versions of Vella are sort of using their musical experience as an outlet for trying to realize their feelings for a certain someone.
Yeah, it is really, really weird to me how that keeps coming up.
Also,
that's not...
Vella, don't reference a better RPG series in your lousy game.
Serious question: Do you find it sort of unusual that Vella, who I would venture to say is probably like the strongest female character in this game, has increasingly over the last few hours of play become defined almost entirely by her relationship with this mystery man? Like, do you think that's just kind of a shitty thing to do to Vella as a character?
Yes, and yes, I absolutely agree with the assessment that notwithstanding just female characters, Vella's absolutely the strongest character in this game, and that as we're kind of peeling away at these layers of her mind, if that's what we're actually doing, then it's kind of... It's portraying these kinds of things like body image issues and self-perceptions of doubt in a way that's fundamentally very different from Alex's and is definitely weakening her as a character, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's kind of the impression I got. Also, this is a pretty underwhelming way to end this, where Vella 15 goes on a monologue about how Alex really isn't that bad. This is really starting to make me think that the mystery man is Alex himself in her alternate universe or some other kind of, weeby type thing.
It's beautiful, Vella.
Yeah, really nice.
This is the experience that listening to Mystical Ultimate LP Legend is apparently imparting onto Alex specifically.
Nice. Not what I normally listen to, but I can tell it's good for the genre. Probably.
Yeah, I don't know what the deal was with any of that interlude. Like well done making it just about time so that the song cuts out when we got to the end of the hallway. But
the music had shown us
what does that imply? Like, if this is just some sort of dream trip that Alex is having, is he like an Esper or something of that nature? Is that why he keeps having these sort of parallel conversations with himself, or, alternate universe versions of himself, whatever the Council of Alex's is?
I surveyed everyone's eyes.
So, the only thing I'm kind of getting out of this is that based on Bella's initial reaction in
They all hated it?
wanting desperately to make sure Alex didn't hear this, is just ultimately pretty mundane, that it's a sense of embarrassment at old work, or the feeling that your art is somehow inadequate, or that it doesn't really deserve to be looked upon.
I almost cried.
But
I hope she's okay.
That seems like, as a concern for this particular story, something that's really not... It's really at odds with every other aspect of the story that we've been dealing with up to this point. It feels so small and pointless compared to what we've been dealing with.
I think that's part of the point of what Y2K is trying to be about. Like, it's sort of trying to be about these very mundane kind of slice of lifey literary fiction type struggles, right?
Is it, though? Because...
yes, granted, you don't usually have people floating around in your house, or people calling you to talk about that time you listened to Losing My Religion by R.E.M.
Sorry I haven't called lately.
Can't deal with this now.
Speaking of which, this guy's back.
Yeah, sorry. Anyway, she's at the playground. Go get her, Tiger.
For the last time, I am not going to kill Andre Almeida for you. As far as where we were with the current thought, I mean, yeah, it just seems like it's slightly too late to suddenly reframe this story as being about these kind of small interactions and these slice of life-esque moments, when the inciting incident for the story is the supernatural kidnapping of a girl that this character has met, and these various characters' connections in an attempt to resolve some kind of unresolvable supernatural or conspiracy-laden trauma that connects them all.
Let me backpedal a bit. I think part of what Y2K is trying to do is to juxtapose the sort of ordinary slice of life daily struggles that these characters are dealing with. Like, apprehension about going to college and hating your first album against these sort of larger-than-life scenarios where you have soul survivors and people, you know, blowing things up with their mind and this sort of thing.
That's absolutely true, but the key issue is that in any other story that deals with those kinds of themes, there's a very specific order of operations that needs to be adhered to. You ever hear about the... there's a trope I'd heard about some time ago called the cosmic horror reveal. You know what that is?
The idea that humans are the real monsters?
No, it's more the idea that, say, the conceit of a story or the plot of a story is usually focused on something relatively mundane, and then partway through the twist becomes that there's some kind of much larger context that gets revealed that suddenly changes the nature of the story. Usually the case that, suddenly everything's taking place in the Cthulhu mythos and everybody's at the mercy of elder gods who are going to destroy everything that they'd worked for.
I won't judge you.
Yeah, I know that.
I have come to understand certain things.
So the idea, though, is that once you make that twist, suddenly the story can't be about what it was about before. The reframing of that context forces the story into a completely different milieu and genre, and then any attempts to then focus on what the story was initially about fall completely flat because it's made explicit that they don't matter in the new context.
It's kind of an escalation of the seriousness of the story. Nothing that you did before that matters.
So, at least in this case, in trying to frame this particular issue as a matter of Vella having this very mundane concern for what people think about her music, doesn't really strike me as being on the same level as everything we've been dealing with at this point in the story.
Of the universe by using physical form to protect them from the harshness of existence.
Oh, also, the terrible piano mixing is back. Coincidentally, it's coming back at the same time that Vella decides to finish her monologue from, like, I think it was the second chapter. The one where they're standing in front of the computer and Vella starts talking about, you know, starts getting all David Cagey.
Leaving the light off at all times, obstructing the undesirables in the room.
Yeah,
Do you understand what I'm
from what
saying
I'm
so
following
far?
here, she's attempting to describe something that's
More or less.
particular to the universe that
continue.
she's from, or is it something that
your reality,
where she's actually
I
trying
was
to
a
describe a
much different person
philosophical
than I am now.
functioning that she's developed?
My reality was
No, this
much
is all just
worse
expo
than
dump,
this one.
you know, stuff.
I was a girl who was entirely lost. From a young age, people thrust their expectations on me. They believed I was destined for artistic greatness. I was a child prodigy in many ways. I had peaked by my early teens, and I was...
I'm also going to throw
no
out
longer
there
able
that
to
this scene
perform or
is
create
remarkably
at a
less
level that matched
effective
the adults around
when you
me.
have the in-game models
was,
of Alex
for
and
all
Vella
intents
just
and
sitting on the
purposes,
swings,
a disappointment.
while the visual novel models are
Picture for a
just
moment
slightly
being a
framing
young
them,
girl who
and it
can't do wrong.
makes for a pretty lousy looking
Everything I
scene,
created,
honestly.
everything I said impressed
Yeah.
those around me.
I mean, I've sort of been comparing
the
this
perfect
game
child
as we go
artist,
to,
but that's
I
all I
guess,
ever
better
was.
games in the genre that
When I
tend to
became an
have
adult,
pretty
my
lengthy
body grew,
cutscenes
but my artistry
that
remained
are
childlike.
rendered in engine.
I
As far as
considered quitting
mainstream
piano,
RPGs go,
considered
you know,
removing
stuff like the
myself from
Tales
art
of
altogether.
series kind of
But
comes across my mind, and it's
something
pretty
told me
famous for
that-
doing that.
And really, I'd
Somewhere
be
along the course of
perfectly
my life,
prepared
I
to
had
accept that's
developed
just
an artist's
limitations of budget
mentality.
and programming time and the like.
I knew I
But even
wasn't
within
a
this
good
game,
adult
they've
artist,
managed to do
but
better
I
in
was
other
still compelled to
circumstances.
create.
Remember when we were talking about Dutch angles
each
while
new thing
Michael
I
was
tried,
showing us around
I
Windtown?
continued to
That was
disappoint
actually
those
kind of
around me.
inspired. It took the limitations of what
was
was
May 22nd,
available and actually did some
1996,
creative
when
things
I
with
met
it.
the man who
Even on
fixed
scenes
this
where
for me.
Alex is monologuing on the couch, sometimes,
At
even if
3:02
we
a.m.,
did get a
I
really
walked into a
disturbing
music club
close-up,
in the city.
there was at least a bit of
He was
variation
on
there.
stage, playing to a small but enthusiastic audience.
When this game actually gives a shit and actually
Each note he
tries,
played on his guitar
and,
seemed
you know,
to
kind of
tell me
accepts the
something
limitations
that I
of
had
its
always
medium and what
known,
it can
but
do,
had
you
never
know, it can
really
genuinely
understood.
turn out some pretty creative stuff.
After he finished, I knew that I had to speak with him. It wasn't before long that we became
And that's just it.
both
Any
romantically
form
and
of artistry is about dealing with the limitations
It was
that
as if
you're
knowing him
running
had
aground
somehow
of.
broken the seal
When
around
this
my mind
game
that was
manages to pull it
preventing
off,
me from creating
that's
something
where you're seeing
worthwhile.
the signs of effort, the signs
The
that
lack
there's
of
some
refinement
kind
to his
of
playing
message
freed
that
me
really
from the
wants to be
confines of
communicated.
rhythmic and
But
artistic
in scenes like
regularity.
this, where Vella
I
just
don't mean to suggest that
continues to talk, and we're not entirely certain which
details
details are important, and we just have the framing of the two of them sitting unmoving on the bench. It's really sad that we
Our relationship was
can't
like a
follow it as
whirlwind
closely.
of physical and emotional affection. Never had I given myself to someone so literally and spiritually before. Together, we wrote A Distant Voice, and I knew that I still had the hopes of being not only a good artist.
Anyway,
but
to go back to what I
an
was talking
interesting
about,
human being.
like, what, about 10 minutes ago? I don't know
Something
how long
terrible
Bella's been
happened
talking.
on May 22nd
This is
of
genuinely pretty
1997.
compelling stuff. Like, I
At
like the
3:02
idea
p.m.,
of having this sort of
daughter had come
tell-all,
and found us
not
together.
quite interview, but discussion
He
with
hadn't yet
Alex where
told
she
his children
kind of
about me.
explains the
I was a
motivations for her
much
actions.
younger
I think
woman.
this is kind of supposed to be the turning point
followed her
where
out
you
into a
finally
coffee
get all
shop.
the information about Vella that
I
you
waited for them
need
to
in order
return,
to judge
hating
her
myself
earlier
more and
actions,
more
you know, in a
for
more
entering his
favorable
life and
light.
making it difficult.
Right.
Not to really say she did anything that earned
I
our
waited
particular
there
scorn,
until
but it does
3:02
explain
a.m.,
things like the room for the
completely
one she
beside
loves
myself.
and the song that she
The
composed.
strange thing is, he never returned. He never came back into his own apartment. I stayed there for a few days, knowing he'd have to
Well,
come back
anyway,
eventually.
to go back to what I was
And
talking
he
about before,
simply never did.
Mhm.
this game
I called his
is...
friends, I called his manager, and
It's so
they
weird
all
to me.
said
Remember
they
what I
hadn't
was saying
seen him.
before about how the game is just like actively
like
kind of
that,
looking
he
for
slipped through
reasons
the
to beat
cracks
up on
of my
Alex,
reality.
particularly around the way that he
And
interacts with Chandra and other women.
Right.
You never saw him again?
This is
I
sort of why that
It
rubs
was
me
May
the wrong
22nd,
way.
1998,
You know, it's
12:01
great
p.m.
to throw in characters that
A
can
minute
challenge
into
your
the
main
first
character's
concert I had put on
perspective,
since
and Vella's
2
certainly
years.
that. Like
I
we
had refused to do our
agreed,
music
Vella's
live
the
or
strongest
release
character in
Distant
this
Voice
game by
until I had seen
a
him.
fair margin.
Right.
Finally,
And
legal
then
pressure
over the
forced me
course
to
of the second
schedule a
act, she just
release
gets
for
more and
May
more tied
22nd,
to
1999.
to
With a
her. She
year-long
becomes
tour
more
to
and more of a
promote it.
satellite character to this mystery
watched
man that she's
in
talking
terror
about,
from behind my
and
piano
I think that's a
as he
damn
wrapped
shame.
his arm around a girl even younger than I. This girl was not his daughter, though she was probably his daughter's
It's
age. I left the stage.
what
and
we're certainly observing
proceeded
is
into
that
myself.
as these
The man who placed his
disconnected
arms
and
around
disparate
that young
stories
woman
come
was
together, or
not the
more
same man
accurately
who
try to
placed his
come
arms
together,
around me so many times.
this game doesn't have a clear
couldn't have
sense
been.
of priority, a clear sense of
The man
theme.
I knew would not have put on such
it,
a
it's a
display
first
of
draft.
affection,
It
knowing
needed
it could hurt someone
it
so
needed
much.
something to refine it down
was
to
in
some
that
more
moment that I
essential
longed to leave
sort
my
of statements
reality
about what
behind,
it's supposed to be.
sever my ties
And
to
that's
my
absolutely a
physical form and
consequence of the
exist
kind
in a
of
different space.
overwrought,
For many days,
overwritten,
nights,
self-indulgent
minutes, seconds,
sort
I
of
sat in my
writing
bed,
that someone who's
slowly
convinced of their
drifting
own
further
artistic genius
into my
will
own
engage
depression.
in, which
Slowly
experience
pulling my
will
mind from my
hopefully
body.
snap them out of.
When the separation
And that's not
happened,
necessarily
it
to
was
say
almost
that
immediate.
any of this would be
it was so
bad
sudden
or
that the
uninteresting in any other
painful moments
context.
leading up to it felt
For
trivial.
me, the idea that Vella had
I
this
was just
this
my
very
mind,
deep, very close
and I
relationship
had
with this
left my
other
physical
man who
body
she
behind.
felt was the performer to her
floated until I
technical
found the
mastery,
reality that seemed
right?
different from
Like
mine.
that's pretty compelling stuff,
Hoping to
especially
find a
when she finds
reality
out
that
later that
contained
he's
him
kind
I
of been
knew.
courting this other lady
Hoping
and
that
her
he had
experience
fallen into
with
this reality,
that.
and we could
You know,
be
that's
together
worth
again.
discussing, but maybe not in this
Was his voice
context.
the one we heard on
And
the
especially if your whole
No,
story is about
no,
how your
it
main
wasn't.
character
I don't know whose voice we
is
heard.
supposed to be the asshole
I was
because he
so
just sort of
nervous staring
sees
at
women
these
as these
guys, I
objects who
almost
kind of
didn't
have
realize
to
it
be
wasn't me
defined
singing.
by their relationship with men. Don't goddamn take your independent character and make
Everyone
them
loved
defined by their relationship with a man.
amazing.
You know what I mean?
Precisely. It's
Really?
it's that case of
I can never tell what people think when I show
I
them
understand
the
this
song.
isn't really meant to be satire,
Well,
or rather, Alex
What
is,
should we do now?
I think, by the author's own intention, meant.
Oh, hell no, game. I'm not doing that.
There it is.
Lead the way.
I'm going to salvage whatever dignity I can. Thanks.
But yeah, what we've. Chapter 4, very good. What was I getting at? What we have established up to this point is that the author's intent seems to be to try to create Alex as some kind of satire. The problem is with any satire, if you're not very careful about how exactly you're framing the subject of your satire and make very clear and concerted efforts to ensure that the object of satire is the target of ridicule, and thus functioning as that they become completely indistinguishable from the thing they are themselves satirizing.
It's like, hey kids, don't be Alex, except if you want Parallel Universe Vella to say you're not really that bad.
Either you dunk on Alex for being a terrible person and completely unself-aware and entirely up his own ass, or you have sympathy for him as a character because he is the confused 20-something that we all were at some point and maybe has social problems and needs to grow up as a person. But you can't have both those statements at the same time.
I think you can have both those statements at the same time if you're a very clever writer.
But that's the rub, isn't it?
I mean, in some ways, yes. I think that is the rub, and that if they had a more seasoned writer come forward and try to tell this story, they would probably be able to get away with making Alex a tragic character.